Cary Grant spent most of his life being described with words that sounded almost too perfect. Charming, elegant, handsome, effortless. The kind of man who could walk into a room, tilt his head slightly, smile once, and make everyone believe they had just seen the definition of Hollywood grace. But the truth was far more complicated than the image. Behind the tailored suits, the polished voice, and the playful confidence was a man who spent decades carefully building a character the world could love, while hiding the parts of himself he was never sure anyone would accept. And perhaps that is why the women he admired most were never just beautiful faces beside him on a movie poster. They were mirrors. Each one reflected a different part of him. Some brought out his wit. Some challenged his control. Some made him softer. Some reminded him that even the most admired man in the world could still feel lonely when the cameras stopped rolling. By the time Cary Grant reached the final chapters of his life, he had already become more than an actor. He had become a standard. Men wanted to be him. Women wanted to be near him. Studios wanted to package him. Journalists wanted to understand him. But Grant himself once admitted, in different ways throughout his life, that Cary Grant was not simply who he was born to be. Cary Grant was something he created. Before the legend, before the tuxedos, before the films that made audiences believe romance could be both funny and heartbreaking, there was Archie Leach, a boy from Bristol with a painful childhood, a missing mother, and a restless hunger to become someone else. That hunger followed him all the way to Hollywood. And when Hollywood finally gave him a new name, it also gave him a new mask. Cary Grant became the man everyone trusted on screen. He could run from danger with elegance. He could fall in love without looking desperate. He could make embarrassment look graceful. He could stand beside the most radiant actresses of the 20th century and never disappear in their light. But what made him unforgettable was not that he overpowered those women. It was that he knew how to meet them. That was rare. Many leading men of his era needed the scene to bend around them. Cary Grant did not. With the right actress, he became sharper, funnier, warmer, more vulnerable. He understood that chemistry was not about stealing attention. It was about timing, listening, reacting, letting the woman across from him become powerful enough that the audience believed love, danger, comedy, and heartbreak were all happening at once. And across his career, there were certain women who did exactly that. They did not simply decorate his films. They revealed him. The first was the woman who could match his speed, his wit, and his sense of absurdity without ever seeming impressed by him. Katharine Hepburn was not the kind of actress who melted beside a charming man. She sparred with him. She pushed against him. She made him look less like a flawless movie idol and more like a man caught off guard by a woman who refused to be handled. In films like Bringing Up Baby and Holiday, their chemistry had the energy of two people who were too intelligent to behave sensibly and too alive to stay still. With Hepburn, Cary Grant became wonderfully unprotected. He was not just suave. He was frantic, confused, silly, human. She had a way of pulling the polished surface away from him, not by force, but by refusing to treat him like a statue. Around her, he could stumble. He could panic. He could look ridiculous and somehow become even more attractive because of it. That was one of the secrets of Cary Grant's greatness. He was handsome enough to be admired from a distance, but brave enough to let comedy make him vulnerable. And Katharine Hepburn understood that better than almost anyone. She did not need him to be perfect. In fact, she was most interesting when she made perfection impossible. But Hepburn was only one side of the story. If she brought out the wild, unpredictable Cary Grant, another actress brought out something smoother, quieter, and perhaps even more dangerous. Irene Dunne was not simply a co-star. She was one of the few actresses who could make Cary Grant's charm feel like a private conversation rather than a performance for the world. When the two appeared together, there was a rhythm between them that felt effortless, but it was built on extraordinary control. They knew when to pause, when to interrupt, when to let a look carry the joke before the line arrived. In The Awful Truth, My Favorite Wife, and Penny Serenade, Dunne and Grant created a kind of emotional dance that moved from comedy to tenderness without warning. One moment they were teasing each other with perfect timing. The next, the audience could feel something deeper underneath the laughter. And that was where Cary Grant became most interesting. Not when he was simply charming, but when the charm seemed to be protecting something bruised. Irene Dunne had a warmth that softened him. She did not challenge him with the same sharp electricity as Hepburn. She invited him into a different kind of honesty. With her, Grant could seem playful but also wounded, sophisticated but also afraid of losing something he cared about. She made his elegance feel domestic, intimate, almost fragile. That mattered because Cary Grant's screen persona was often built on control. He knew how to enter a frame. He knew how to hold silence. He knew how to make panic look stylish. But with Dunne, control was never enough. Their best scenes worked because beneath the polished banter, there was always the possibility that these two people might actually hurt each other, miss each other, or need each other more than they wanted to admit. And perhaps that is why the actresses Cary Grant admired were never just measured by glamour. Glamour was everywhere in old Hollywood. Beauty could get a woman on a poster. It could not create a legend beside Cary Grant. To do that, she needed something more. She needed timing, intelligence, mystery, the courage to meet him as an equal. Hepburn gave him chaos. Dunne gave him warmth. But the next woman gave him something even more haunting. She entered his career like a shadow wrapped in elegance. And beside her, Cary Grant was no longer just the man audiences trusted to make them laugh. He became a man standing dangerously close to desire, guilt, loyalty, and heartbreak. Her name was Ingrid Bergman, and once she appeared beside him, the story of Cary Grant's greatest leading ladies became much darker. Ingrid Bergman did not simply stand beside Cary Grant. She changed the air around him. With Katharine Hepburn, he could be frantic and funny. With Irene Dunne, he could be warm and wounded. But with Bergman, something more dangerous appeared. The smile was still there. The elegance was still there. The famous Cary Grant control was still there. Yet underneath it all, the audience could feel tension, as if the perfect man was suddenly standing too close to a secret he could not escape. That was the magic of Notorious. In that film, Grant was not the easy romantic hero audiences thought they knew. He was colder, sharper, more guarded. He played a man who loved, but could not fully show it. A man whose duty and desire were pulling him in opposite directions. And Bergman, with her sadness, beauty, and emotional honesty, made that conflict feel painfully real. She did not simply fall in love with him on screen. She forced the audience to wonder what it would cost a woman to love a man who was too proud, too afraid, and too disciplined to reach for her when it mattered most. Beside Bergman, Cary Grant seemed less like a dream and more like a locked room. That was why their chemistry remained unforgettable. It was not playful in the usual way. It was not bright, fast, and sparkling like his comedies. It was heavy with silence. Every glance felt delayed. Every word seemed to hide another word underneath it. And when Grant looked at Bergman, the audience saw a man fighting himself. Not because he lacked feeling, but because feeling was the one thing his carefully built image had never fully allowed him to surrender to. Ingrid Bergman brought out the moral weight in Cary Grant. She made him look responsible, conflicted, almost cruel at times, but never empty. That was a rare gift. Many actresses could make him look handsome. Bergman made him look haunted. And perhaps that is why their later reunion in Indiscreet felt so different. Years had passed. The darkness of Notorious was replaced by sophistication, humor, and adult romance. Yet even there, beneath the charm, there was still a sense that these two performers understood something private about timing, restraint, and emotional distance. They did not need melodrama to create tension. They only needed a pause, a lifted eyebrow, a line delivered a half-second too carefully. Cary Grant admired performers who could make elegance feel alive. Ingrid Bergman did that. She made elegance tremble. But if Bergman represented depth, danger, and emotional shadow, another woman represented something almost opposite. Light, royalty, coolness, a beauty so controlled that it felt untouchable. And when Cary Grant stood beside her, the screen did not feel heavy. It shimmered. Grace Kelly entered Cary Grant's world like a woman who had already mastered the secret language of restraint. She was young, luminous, and calm in a way that made everyone around her seem louder than necessary. In To Catch a Thief, she and Grant did not create chemistry by chasing each other emotionally. They created it through distance, through elegance, through the thrill of two people pretending they were not as interested as they clearly were. By then, Cary Grant was no longer the young man scrambling to prove himself in Hollywood. He had become a legend in motion, and Grace Kelly met him not with nervous admiration, but with her own impossible composure. That mattered, because the older Cary Grant became, the harder it was for any leading lady to stand beside him without seeming overwhelmed by the myth. Grace Kelly did not seem overwhelmed. She seemed like she belonged in the same rare atmosphere. Their scenes had a strange electricity because both of them understood the power of not giving too much away. Grant could lean back, smile, and let the audience come to him. Kelly could do the same. She did not chase his charm. She answered it. She made him work without ever appearing to try. That was part of her power. And for Cary Grant, who had spent so many years turning himself into the ultimate screen gentleman, Grace Kelly may have represented the perfect screen match for that later version of himself. She was not chaotic like Hepburn, not warmly domestic like Dunne, not emotionally stormy like Bergman. She was polished, mysterious, and controlled, almost like the female reflection of the Cary Grant image itself. But that was also what made their pairing so fascinating. Because when two perfectly composed people stand together, the drama is not in what they say, is in what breaks through despite them. A glance that lingers too long, a silence that feels too charged, a smile that arrives just a little too late. That was the world Cary Grant and Grace Kelly created together. A world of diamonds, danger, moonlit terraces, and desire hidden behind flawless manners. It was romantic, but never messy. Seductive, but never desperate. And because Kelly would soon leave Hollywood to become a princess, her screen partnership with Grant became wrapped in a kind of permanent nostalgia. It felt brief, beautiful, and untouchable. For audiences, Grace Kelly was the fantasy. For Cary Grant, she may have been something more specific. A reminder that true screen glamour was not about excess. It was about control, mystery, the confidence to say less and mean more. And yet, Cary Grant's story with his greatest leading ladies could not end with perfection, because the most revealing partnerships were not always the most polished. Sometimes the woman who mattered most to the legend was not the one who made him look flawless, but the one who exposed the strange sadness underneath the fantasy. That is where the story begins to turn again. Because after Grace Kelly, there was another actress who met Cary Grant not in the reckless energy of youth and not in the cold danger of espionage, but in a romance built around longing, timing, and regret. Her name was Deborah Kerr. Deborah Kerr brought out a different Cary Grant, one shaped not by speed, danger, or cool glamour, but by longing. In an affair to remember, Grant was no longer merely the clever man with a perfect comeback. He was not the frantic romantic hero, not the elegant thief, not the guarded spy. He was something quieter and more exposed. A man who believed he understood life, pleasure, and love, until one woman made him realize that his heart had been moving through the world without ever truly stopping. That was the power of Deborah Kerr beside him. She did not need to overpower Cary Grant. She did not need to outshine him. Her strength was more delicate than that. She gave the film a kind of emotional stillness, and inside that stillness, Grant's famous charm began to look almost defensive. The audience could sense that his smile was no longer just a weapon of seduction. It was a shield. He laughed because he did not want to admit he had been moved. He joked because silence would have revealed too much. And that is why their romance felt so painful. It was not the love of young people rushing toward each other without fear. It was the love of adults who understood timing, consequence, reputation, and regret. They knew that wanting something did not mean they could have it. They knew that one missed moment could become a lifetime of wondering. Cary Grant, who had so often seemed untouchable on screen, suddenly looked breakable. Deborah Kerr made that possible because she played emotion with restraint. She could look wounded without collapsing. She could look hopeful without becoming naive. She could make love feel noble and impossible at the same time. And beside her, Grant's elegance became tragic. The very thing that made him beautiful, his control, also made him seem like a man who might lose happiness because he waited 1 second too long to claim it. That was the hidden sadness in Cary Grant's image. He appeared to have everything: beauty, fame, wealth, admiration. But on screen, again and again, the greatest actresses beside him revealed the same quiet question. What does a man like that do when charm is no longer enough? What happens when the smile cannot protect him from love, disappointment, or age? Deborah Kerr answered that question with tenderness. She showed a Cary Grant who could still be romantic, but whose romance carried the shadow of time. In their most memorable moments, it felt as if both characters were not just falling in love with each other, but with the version of life they feared they had almost missed. That is why their story stayed with audiences. It was not only beautiful, it hurt. And yet, even after Deborah Kerr, there was still another kind of actress who revealed a final, surprising side of Cary Grant. Someone younger, brighter, and associated with a different era of screen elegance. Someone who did not belong to his earliest years of screwball comedy or the shadowy world of Hitchcock suspense. Someone who arrived when Grant was already a legend and could have easily turned the film into a museum piece. Instead, she helped make him feel alive again. Audrey Hepburn was unlike the other women in this story because her presence beside Cary Grant carried an immediate complication. He was older, much older. Hollywood had changed. The rhythms of romance had changed. And Grant, always aware of image, reportedly had concerns about the age gap when he appeared with younger leading ladies. That awareness is part of what made Charade so fascinating. The film did not pretend he was a reckless young lover. It let him be mature, mysterious, amused, and slightly unreachable. And Audrey Hepburn knew exactly how to play against that. She brought lightness to the screen, but not emptiness. Her charm was quick, delicate, and intelligent. She could seem innocent for a moment, then suddenly sharp. She could make vulnerability feel stylish and curiosity feel romantic. Beside her, Cary Grant did not need to compete with youth. He needed to become the man who had lived long enough to know more than he said. That gave their chemistry a unique flavor. It was playful, but with secrets underneath. Hepburn's character looked at him with fascination, suspicion, and attraction all at once. Grant answered with that legendary half-smile, as if he knew the game but would never explain the rules too early. The result was not the burning tragedy of Bergman, nor the aching regret of Kerr, nor the icy glamour of Kelly. It was a late-career sparkle, the kind that made audiences remember why Cary Grant had survived so many changes in Hollywood. Because Grant did not survive on looks alone. He survived because he could adapt his charm to the woman in front of him. With Hepburn, he became lighter, more teasing, more mysterious. He allowed her energy to lead, then shaped his performance around it. That took confidence. A lesser star might have tried to dominate the film, to remind everyone that he was Cary Grant. But Grant understood something deeper. He knew that a great leading lady did not reduce his power. She renewed it, and Audrey Hepburn did exactly that. She showed that even near the end of his acting career, Cary Grant still had timing, elegance, and that rare ability to make romance feel like a secret shared with the audience. But by then, the larger story was becoming clear. Each actress had revealed a different Cary Grant, and each version carried a truth he could never fully hide. Hepburn gave him chaos. Dunne gave him warmth. Bergman gave him darkness. Kelly gave him polished desire. Kerr gave him longing. Audrey Hepburn gave him late-life sparkle. But the question remained, was there one woman among them who saw the real Cary Grant most clearly? That question followed Cary Grant even when he was no longer making movies. Because the deeper you look at his career, the more it becomes clear that his greatest leading ladies were not simply women he performed with. They were women who tested the identity he had spent his life constructing. Every time he appeared beside one of them, a different crack appeared in the mask. Not enough to destroy it. Just enough to let the audience sense that the perfect gentleman was hiding a more fragile man underneath. And that is why the idea of the 6 actresses he admired most feels so powerful. It is not really a list. It is a map. Katharine Hepburn showed the Cary Grant who could lose control and still remain magnetic. Irene Dunne showed the Cary Grant who could laugh while carrying emotional bruises beneath the surface. Ingrid Bergman showed the Cary Grant who could love with restraint so painful it almost looked like cruelty. Grace Kelly showed the Cary Grant who had mastered glamour so completely that desire became a game of silence and glances. Deborah Kerr showed the Cary Grant who could ache for a life that arrived too late. Audrey Hepburn showed the Cary Grant who still had magic, even as time and Hollywood were moving around him. But none of those women could have revealed so much if Cary Grant had not trusted them in front of the camera. That trust was everything. Cary Grant was not an actor who simply walked into a scene and delivered charm. His charm had structure. His timing had architecture. He knew when to move, when to freeze, when to let the woman beside him take control of the emotional temperature. That is why his best films do not feel like solo performances. They feel like duels, dances, confessions disguised as entertainment. And perhaps the most fascinating thing is that Cary Grant, the most admired man in Hollywood, often looked most alive when he allowed a woman to unsettle him. Hepburn unsettled him with chaos. Bergman unsettled him with pain. Kelly unsettled him with elegance. Kerr unsettled him with longing. Audrey Hepburn unsettled him with youth and mystery. Dunne unsettled him with emotional truth hidden beneath comedy. In each case, the woman did not weaken his screen image. She deepened it. That was something many people misunderstood about Cary Grant. They saw the surface and assumed the surface was the achievement. The perfect suit, the smooth voice, the easy walk, the romantic smile. But the real achievement was that he made perfection feel nervous. He made confidence feel like something a man had chosen after surviving insecurity. He made style feel like armor. And the actresses who mattered most were the ones who made the armor visible. When he stood beside Katharine Hepburn, the armor became comic. It slipped, bent, and nearly fell apart. When he stood beside Ingrid Bergman, the armor became tragic. It held too tightly, protecting him from the very feeling that might have saved him. When he stood beside Deborah Kerr, the armor became sad. It looked beautiful, but it could not stop time. When he stood beside Grace Kelly, the armor became seductive. 2 perfect surfaces reflected each other until the tension was almost unbearable. When he stood beside Irene Dunne, the armor became domestic and tender, as if the polished man might finally be allowed to sit down and be tired. And when he stood beside Audrey Hepburn, the armor became playful again, touched by the last golden light of a career that was nearly over. This is why the story is not about who was the most beautiful. They were all beautiful. Hollywood made sure of that. The real question is who made Cary Grant the most human. And the answer depends on which Cary Grant you believe was closest to the truth. If you believe the real Cary Grant was the restless boy who never escaped the wound of becoming someone else, then Katharine Hepburn may have come closest because she stripped away his dignity and made him wonderfully absurd. She reminded audiences that behind elegance, there could still be panic, childishness, and joy. If you believe the real Cary Grant was a man who wanted warmth but was afraid of needing it, then Irene Dunne may have seen him most clearly. Her films with him turned marriage, separation, laughter, and pain into something recognizable, something less mythic and more human. If you believe the real Cary Grant was a man trapped between desire and control, then Ingrid Bergman may have been the key. With her, his restraint did not look empty. It looked wounded. His silence did not seem cold. It seemed like a confession he could not afford to make. If you believe the real Cary Grant was the final masterpiece of Hollywood glamour, then Grace Kelly was his perfect reflection. She met the myth at its highest level and did not blink. If you believe the real Cary Grant was a romantic haunted by timing, regret, and the fear of lost happiness, then Deborah Kerr may have revealed the most heartbreaking version of him. And if you believe the real Cary Grant was a legend trying to remain alive in a younger world, then Audrey Hepburn gave him one last chance to sparkle without pretending he was still the man he had been 20 years before. But there's another possibility. Maybe Cary Grant admired these women because each one knew something he did not. Each of them possessed a kind of freedom he had spent his whole life chasing. Hepburn had the freedom to be eccentric. Dunne had the freedom to be emotionally open. Bergman had the freedom to suffer honestly. Kelly had the freedom to be still. Kerr had the freedom to be vulnerable with dignity. Audrey Hepburn had the freedom to be delicate without seeming weak. And Cary Grant, for all his charm, was never entirely free. He had become one of the most beloved men in the world by turning himself into a work of art. But a work of art is also a prison. Every gesture must be perfect. Every smile must arrive on time. Every weakness must be turned into style before the audience notices it. That is what makes his admiration for these actresses so touching. They were not just his co-stars. They were the women who helped him escape Cary Grant for a few minutes at a time. That escape may have been the thing Cary Grant valued most, even if he never said it in exactly those words. Because by the time audiences knew him as Cary Grant, the transformation had already been so complete that the original man almost disappeared from public view. Archie Leach had been poor, uncertain, wounded by family secrets, and shaped by a childhood that never gave him the safety he seemed to radiate on screen. Cary Grant, by contrast, was smooth, controlled, rich, adored, and almost impossibly composed. The world did not simply watch him. It believed in him. But belief can become a burden. The more people admired Cary Grant, the less room there was for him to be ordinary. He could not easily be awkward. He could not easily be lost. He could not easily be broken. The image had become so powerful that even his private pain risked being swallowed by the legend. That is why the women who shared the screen with him mattered so much. In the safety of performance, they could do what the public rarely could. They could challenge the myth without destroying it. They could make Cary Grant feel real. Katharine Hepburn did it by refusing to worship him. There was no softness in the way she met him on screen. She came at him with speed, confidence, and a kind of comic fearlessness that forced him to abandon dignity. With her, he could fall, panic, stammer, and lose control, and somehow the audience loved him more for it. She showed that his beauty was not fragile. It could survive embarrassment. Irene Dunne did it differently. She made him seem like a man who belonged not only in glamorous rooms and dangerous plots, but in the complicated emotional spaces of marriage, separation, forgiveness, and memory. With Dunne, Cary Grant did not simply seduce. He negotiated. He regretted. He softened. She gave his charm a home, and then made that home feel vulnerable. Ingrid Bergman revealed the opposite side. She brought out the man who could not say what he felt until silence had already done damage. Their scenes together carried the ache of restraint. Grant's face, so often open to comedy, became guarded. His stillness became painful. Bergman made him look like a man trapped inside his own discipline, and that may have been closer to the truth than audiences realized. Grace Kelly turned his image into pure glamour, but not empty glamour. She matched his elegance so completely that their chemistry became a contest of control. Neither seemed willing to surrender first. That made every glance feel charged, every pause meaningful. With Kelly, Cary Grant did not look younger, and he did not need to. He looked timeless. Deborah Kerr did something perhaps even more delicate. She made him feel mortal. In an affair to remember, the romance was not about conquest. It was about delay, hope, misunderstanding, and the terrible possibility that life might pass by just when happiness was finally within reach. Kerr made Grant's refinement seem heartbreaking because she showed that a man could have perfect manners and still be powerless before time. Audrey Hepburn gave him a final kind of renewal. She brought youth, wit, and lightness, but she did not make him seem old by comparison. Instead, she made him seem mysterious, like a man carrying decades of secrets behind a smile. With her, Cary Grant's age became part of the charm. He was not pretending to be young. He was showing that elegance could survive the passing years. And so the six actresses were not just names in a career. They were chapters in the construction and deconstruction of a legend. The public loved Cary Grant because he seemed finished, complete, polished to perfection. But the best actresses beside him proved that he was most compelling when he seemed unfinished, when he was being pulled, tested, cornered, softened, or exposed. They did not take away from his image. They gave it depth. They made the dream complicated enough to last. That is why, near the end of his life, when people looked back at Cary Grant, they were not only remembering the man in the suit. They were remembering the women who stood across from him and made that suit feel like armor. They were remembering the laughter with Hepburn, the tenderness with Dunne, the shadows with Bergman, the moonlit glamour with Kelly, the heartbreak with Kerr, and the sparkling uncertainty with Audrey Hepburn. But behind all of it was one lonely irony. Cary Grant became immortal by playing a man who always seemed to know exactly who he was. Yet the story of his life suggests something more fragile. Perhaps he was always searching for the right role, the right woman, the right mirror, the right moment when someone would look past Cary Grant and recognize Archie Leach still standing there, waiting to be seen. And maybe that is why these six actresses mattered so much. They did not simply admire Cary Grant. For brief moments, they made him visible. But visibility was never simple for Cary Grant. The world saw him every day. It saw his face on posters, his name above titles, his smile preserved in scenes that would outlive almost everyone who created them. Yet being seen by millions is not the same as being known. In fact, for Cary Grant, fame may have made true recognition even harder. The more clearly the world saw the image, the more deeply the man behind it could disappear. That is why the actresses beside him carried so much meaning. They were not just professional partners. They were the rare people allowed to stand close enough to the myth to disturb it. And each disturbance mattered. When Katharine Hepburn made him frantic, the audience laughed, but something deeper was happening. She was proving that Cary Grant did not need to be untouchable to be loved. He could be ridiculous. He could be overwhelmed. He could lose the upper hand. For a man whose public image depended so much on control, that was almost radical. Hepburn made imperfection part of his beauty. When Irene Dunne met him with warmth, she revealed another possibility. She showed that charm did not always have to be a performance. It could be a defense against tenderness. Their best moments felt as if two sophisticated people were trying to laugh their way around pain, because admitting the pain directly would be too dangerous. Dunne made Cary Grant feel less like a fantasy lover and more like a man who might actually sit across a dinner table after an argument, wounded but still hoping to be forgiven. When Ingrid Bergman looked at him, the comedy vanished. Something darker entered the room. With her, Cary Grant's restraint became almost unbearable. He did not seem cold because he lacked feeling. He seemed cold because feeling had become too dangerous. Bergman made him look like a man who had built a wall so high that even love had to bleed before it could get through. Grace Kelly brought a different kind of exposure. She did not crack his image. She refined it until it became almost blinding. Together, they showed what Hollywood elegance looked like at its most controlled. But beneath the beauty was tension. Two people who looked perfect together, yet whose perfection created distance. Kelly made Cary Grant's glamour feel seductive, but also lonely. Deborah Kerr brought him back down to earth. With her, the fantasy had consequences. Love was not just sparkle and wit. It was timing, waiting, missing the right moment, facing the possibility that the life you imagined might not arrive when you were ready for it. Kerr made Cary Grant's romantic image feel older, sadder, and more human. Audrey Hepburn gave him one final reflection. Not the reflection of who he had been, but of who he could still be. Beside her, he was not trying to outrun age. He was turning age into mystery. He allowed the years to sit inside his performance, not as weakness, but as depth. Hepburn made him seem like a man who knew more than he said, and whose silence was part of the attraction. Together, These 6 women formed a kind of secret biography. Not the biography written in dates, contracts, marriages, and headlines. Something more emotional. A biography of tone, of glances, of the parts of himself Cary Grant could only reveal when another performer was strong enough to pull them into the light. That may be the real reason audiences still return to those films. They are not only watching Cary Grant be charming, they are watching him be discovered. Scene by scene, woman by woman, his legend becomes less simple. The charming man becomes frightened. The elegant man becomes uncertain. The romantic man becomes regretful. The perfect man becomes human. And the more human he becomes, the more unforgettable he is. Because Cary Grant's greatest trick was not convincing the world that he was perfect. It was making the world care when perfection began to tremble. By the end of his life, he had stepped away from acting for many years. Hollywood had changed. The era that created him had faded. New stars had arrived, new styles, new kinds of masculinity, new ways of telling love stories. But Cary Grant remained. Not because he belonged to every era, but because he seemed to come from a place beyond era, a place where style and sadness could exist in the same smile. And yet, if we strip away the mythology, the question becomes painfully simple. Who did Cary Grant admire most? Maybe the answer is not one woman. Maybe it was all 6 because each one gave him something the public could not. They gave him permission to stop being complete. They gave him space to be contradicted. They let him be funny, tender, wounded, glamorous, regretful, and mysterious. They helped the world see that Cary Grant was not a flawless man. He was a man who turned his wounds into grace. And that is why the story of the 6 actresses he admired most is not just about Hollywood beauty. It is about the strange sadness of becoming an icon. It is about a man who spent his life perfecting a mask, only to be remembered most deeply for the moments when 6 extraordinary women helped him take it off. In the end, Cary Grant's greatest mystery was not how he became so beloved. It was how much of himself he had to hide in order to be loved that way. The audience saw the polish. They saw the raised eyebrow, the perfect pause, the effortless movement across a room. They saw a man who seemed to carry romance as naturally as breathing. But the women who stood opposite him on screen revealed something else. They showed that underneath the ease was effort. Underneath the charm was discipline. Underneath the smile was a man who had learned, very early, that survival sometimes meant becoming someone no one could reject. That was the wound inside the legend. And maybe that is why Cary Grant's screen relationships still feel alive decades later. They are not just old Hollywood fantasies wrapped in beautiful costumes and black and white lighting. They are emotional negotiations. Every great actress beside him seemed to ask the same unspoken question. Who are you when the charm stops working? Katharine Hepburn asked it through chaos. She pulled him into a world where dignity could not survive, where the polished gentleman had to chase, stumble, react, and surrender to absurdity. Around her, he could not hide behind elegance for long. She made him funny because she made him unsafe. And in that danger, he became freer. Irene Dunne asked it through intimacy. She met him not as a dream man, but as a man capable of losing love, damaging love, and trying to repair love. Her warmth made his performance feel lived in. With her, the question was not whether Cary Grant could charm a woman. The question was whether he could stay when charm was no longer enough. Ingrid Bergman asked it through pain. She turned his silence into a wound. In Notorious, his control did not protect him. It condemned him. He loved, but he delayed. He cared, but he concealed. He watched suffering from behind the mask of duty. Beside Bergman, Cary Grant's sophistication became almost tragic because the audience could see that he was not emotionless. He was imprisoned by everything he refused to say. Grace Kelly asked it through perfection. She stood beside him like an equal creation of the same dream factory. Together they looked almost unreal, too beautiful, too composed, too aware of their own power. But that perfection had loneliness inside it. With Kelly, Grant's image reached its most dazzling form. and yet the very brightness of it made the shadow behind it easier to feel. Deborah Kerr asked it through regret. She made him face time. Not danger, not comedy, not seduction, but time. The kind of time that passes quietly while people hesitate. The kind of time that turns missed chances into lifelong ache. With Kerr, Grant's romance became vulnerable because it was no longer guaranteed. Love could be lost. Happiness could arrive late. A man could be adored by the world and still find himself waiting for one person who never came when expected. Audrey Hepburn asked it through renewal. She brought him into a more modern rhythm, lighter and quicker, but never shallow. She allowed him to age without embarrassment. She made him mysterious rather than outdated. Beside her, Cary Grant proved that true screen presence was not youth. It was control, intelligence, and the ability to suggest a whole lifetime behind a single smile. That was the final gift these women gave him. They allowed him to change without disappearing. And for a star like Cary Grant, that may have been the hardest thing of all. Hollywood loves an image, but it can be cruel to the person trapped inside it. Once the world decides what you are, it rarely gives you permission to become anything else. Grant had to remain Cary Grant, even when Archie Leach was aging, remembering, questioning, and perhaps wondering what life might have been like if he had never needed to invent such a perfect man. So when people say that before he died, Cary Grant revealed the 6 actresses he admired most, the deeper truth is not just in the names. It is in what those names represent. They represent 6 doors into a man who is usually seen only through glass. 6 moments when a mask shifted. 6 women strong enough, gifted enough, and mysterious enough to make a legend feel vulnerable. And perhaps that is the reason audiences still search for him. Not because he was flawless, but because, in the right woman's eyes, he was not.